When tyrants fall, disorder sweeps over the land. Riot and bloodshed multiply. And sometimes, mistaking vengeance for justice, the people seek out their former torturers to vent their rage upon them.
When talking about World War II, the Allies, especially the US forces, are often portrayed as the great heroes of the conflict. This is particularly true when Americans themselves recount the story of how they saved all of Europe and defeated Hitler. However, more than once these men confused justice with vengeance and committed bloody war crimes. From unjustified massacres to rape and sexual harassment against women, US troops showed that they could sink to the same level as the Italian fascists or the Nazis themselves. But since history is always written by the victors, according to the laws imposed by the Allied countries after their victory, most of these crimes were neither judged at Nuremberg nor any other tribunal. With the impunity granted by public opinion for being on the opposite side of the world's most evil man, the US Army concealed its most despicable acts for decades. But today, we will reveal the dark truth about the brutality of the Americans during World War II. Let's begin. It is difficult to pinpoint the exact moment when American troops unleashed their inner beast and decided to commit the bloodiest war crimes. However, we will start by highlighting some of their most violent actions, with the massacres they carried out against unarmed enemies and the civilian population of Italy. The first notable event took place in July 1943, when the 7th Fleet of the United States invaded Sicily. During this historic incursion, several events foreshadowed the illegal actions of the troops under Lieutenant General Patton. The first are known as the Massacres massacres. On July 14th, when the 1st Battalion of the 180th Infantry Regiment landed on the island, it immediately marched southwest with the intention of capturing the air bases near the town of Santo Pietro. Once there, they had to face the resistance of the fascist army, accompanied by a handful of Nazis. The Allies triumphed and captured 35 Italians and 2 Germans, who were executed as unarmed prisoners of war, with a close-range shot directly to the heart. On that same day, but on the other side of Sicily, a bloody event was about to occur. 4 days before the battle at the airbase, Company C of the same battalion had moved to the Dorillo River, east of the Biscari airport, to contain a mortar and machine gun attack, while their comrades liberated the airfield. Captain John T. Compton held the position for 3 days without sleeping. As he himself stated, he was too excited and alert to get any rest. On the 4th day, July 14th, they began receiving shots from an extremely accurate sniper who managed to wound or kill 12 of Compton's 34 men. In an attempt to locate the sniper's vantage point, soldier Raymond C. Marlowe ran towards the source of the shots when he encountered an Italian soldier armed with a rifle. Marlowe raised his weapon and ordered his enemy to surrender. The Mussolini soldier ducked into a small dugout, but after a few minutes emerged with his hands up, accompanied by 35 other Italians, several of whom were dressed in civilian clothes. Marlowe escorted them up the hill to his outpost and informed his squad leader, Sergeant Hare, about the prisoners. When Hare asked Compton what to do with the prisoners, Compton, without flinching, replied, "Shoot them all." The men of Company C assembled a squad of 11 soldiers and proceeded to execute the 36 prisoners of war, who died amid screams of horror and pleas. Some tried to escape but were shot in the back. In both incidents, the superiors of the American officers responsible for the massacres hesitated about whether to report the facts or keep them secret, but eventually, they sent the reports. When American General Bradley learned of the bloody acts, he informed General Patton, who would leave a note in his diary about his thoughts on the matter. "I told Bradley that it was probably an exaggeration, but that in any case he should tell the officer to certify that the dead were snipers or had attempted to escape or something like that, as it would cause a scandal in the press and also anger civilians. Anyway, they are dead, so nothing can be done about it. As criminals say, the dead do not speak, so these murders went unpunished for many years, and most of those responsible were never judged. However, the Biscari tragedy, which left 73 dead, would be nothing compared to what the United States Army would do a year later." When the Americans stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, they arrived on the continental territory of occupied Europe like a tide of freedom, promising to end the inhumane Nazi invasion in France. It is clear that initially they were received as heroes, praised by Parisians as they drove their jeeps through the streets of the city, greeted by the civilian population. But things would not take long to change, and a few weeks later, French citizens were already talking about the new reign of terror of the Americans, who seemed to have simply replaced the Nazis. According to local reports, U.S. troops were driving drunk, causing accidents in the cities, and mistreating the community. But the worst were the sexual abuses committed against women. To put it in context, during World War II, some French cities had acquired a widespread reputation for vice and pleasure. During the occupation, the Nazis increased the number of available prostitutes to an astonishing 10,000 women, working actively to satisfy the invaders. Of course, some brothels amassed fortunes, while in other, more precarious spaces, the women worked out of obligation. In the worst cases, they served their clients at gunpoint. This was because Adolf Hitler, fearing that his troops might develop emotional attachments to local women, preferred that soldiers satisfy their sexual needs without engaging their emotions. But no matter what language they speak, men always boast about their supposed conquests, even if the first date is really an SS-organized raid. Thus, the reputation of French women as almost divinely created to please men spread beyond territorial borders. This led the Americans, when they entered the territory, to believe they were arriving in a land of carnal excess and lust. In Normandy alone, the gateway to the European country, 208 rapes and 30 homicides by Uncle Sam's men against the civilian population were recorded. In a very short time, the French began to say that while with the Germans they had to hide, with the Americans they had to hide the women. But the minds of General Patton's troops had been shaped both by the rumors spread and by the opinions coming from the United States. During the liberation of France, the military set up a brothel of dubious legality near the village of Saint-Renan. This was to be used as a sort of cover to counter the wave of accusations against Allied soldiers for their grotesque acts. However, the remedy was worse than the disease, and the place closed just 5 hours later, as the High Command considered that the existence of a brothel run by the military would cause dissent in public opinion. Evidently, the Americans entered Paris seeking relaxation, and the post-traumatic stress of the population would not prevent them. According to some data collected by various researchers and historians, U.S. forces raped about 4,500 French women between 1944 and 1945. And if you think this number is brutal, the truth is that the troops wearing the supposed colors of liberty did a lot of damage in France, but far exceeded it in Germany. While there are reports that indicate that about 10,000 German women and girls were raped, there are few records that give a detailed account of these events. However, the account of journalist Osmar White, an Australian war correspondent who accompanied American troops during the war, has survived to this day. He wrote about it as follows: "After the fighting had passed on German soil, there were many rapes by combat troops and by those immediately following them. The incidents varied from unit to unit according to the attitude of the commanding officer. In some cases, the offenders were identified, tried by military courts, and punished. The legal branch of the military was reticent. However, it admitted that some soldiers had been shot for brutal or perverted sexual offenses against German women, particularly if the soldiers were black. However, it is a fact that many women were raped by white Americans. No action was taken against the culprits. A report circulated in one quarter that a certain very distinguished commander made the joke, "Copulation without conversation does not constitute brotherhood." In war, above all, it is evident that emotions can compromise soldiers, which was clear in the case of France and Germany. However, the Allies saw Europeans as similar people. So imagine the extent of the violence that these types of crimes had when they also involved racism. This is the case of the sexual abuses committed by the Allies during the occupation of Japan, where cases of were recorded that ranged from girls under 10 years old to elderly women of 80 years old. These cases were particularly nefarious due to the deep xenophobia that existed in the West, who allowed themselves to have bloodthirsty, barbaric, and animalistic attitudes towards Asian women. During the first 10 days of the occupation, some 1,000 rapes by the Allies against Japanese women were reported. Although this rate was reduced by the intervention of British and Canadian officers, it is estimated that in the following months, 40 abuses were committed daily. Some commanders even encouraged them, as was the case of General Robert L. Eichelberger, who allowed, in his own words, his boys to relax with local girls and adolescents. However, the military leadership was concerned about the sexual activity of its men, so in early 1946, it decided to prohibit prostitution in most of the subjugated areas of Japan. This only encouraged violence and sexual access by the troops towards Japanese women. On April 4th, 50 soldiers broke into a hospital in Omori Prefecture and raped 77 women, including a mother who had just given birth. In a blood frenzy, the soldiers murdered the newborn baby during the assault. On April 11th, 40 American soldiers cut the telephone lines in a residential area in the city of Nagoya and simultaneously raped a large number of women, aged between 10 and 55. By mid-1946, sexual abuses were reported daily at 300. Of course, outside the occupied zones, nothing was known about the war crimes carried out by the Allies. There was, as in liberated Europe, a deep spirit of institutional censorship on the part of the high commands of all Western armies. On September 10, 1945, Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied powers, had issued press codes declaring illegal the publication of reports or statistics contrary to the objectives of the occupation, with a clear intention of sweeping under the rug the most terrible acts committed by his soldiers. Needless to say, the punishment for violating these prohibitions was extremely severe, and even mentioning censorship resulted in formal penalties. But the horrors did not stop at the terrible sexual abuses. There remains another war crime unaddressed by the United States. Americans arrived at Dachau on April 29, 1945, towards the end of the camp's evacuation. As they advanced towards one of the darkest places in occupied Europe, they encountered a transport with 4,000 prisoners, which they failed to intercept in time, and it continued towards Germany. After this incident, the Americans decided to quicken their pace. The 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions covered 60 kilometers along the Danube, arriving much earlier than anticipated by Hitler's troops. It was Sunday at noon. The camp was completely quiet, and the SS guards were doing their shift, monitoring from their towers the movements of the prisoners still remaining in the Dachau camp. A chilling scream shattered the calm of the day. "The Americans! The Americans!" The man ran towards the gate in a vain attempt to attract the soldiers' attention, but one of the guards aimed at him from behind, killing him instantly. In any case, it was unnecessary. The U.S. infantry had already spotted the towers and began shooting at the German officers. The SS members, being vastly outnumbered, decided to come down from their positions, surrender their weapons, and unconditionally surrender. After the first guards had knelt, an American soldier approached and without a second thought, executed them on the spot with his pistol. But this was taken as an isolated incident until the Americans finally entered the camp. The sight of the macabre and brutal acts that the Nazis had carried out in Dachau unleashed a wave of executions by the Americans. The reason was no longer with them, only a bloodthirsty thirst for revenge. Tower B, the second lookout post, was also the scene of a systematic shooting of German guards who, after surrendering, were executed with a well-aimed shot to the head. Lieutenant Walsh captured 4 German soldiers, whom he forced into a freight car. There were about 120 Jewish corpses in it, and after keeping the guards there for a while, observing what they themselves had done, he murdered them in cold blood. Later, about a dozen prisoners of war were shot in a coal depot by a 19-year-old gunner who was found in a deep state of shock, crying and screaming that they had tried to escape, although no one would agree with him. Before the end of the first day, madness took hold of the men at Dachau. After a long time, and at the end of his life, the anesthesiologist Wilsey, who belonged to the medical corps of the battalion that carried out the Dachau massacre, recalled the events and attributed the macabre events to a kind of delirium. For him, the horrors that the American soldiers had to witness, added to the stress of war, were too much for their psyche. On the morning of the second day, the Americans forced about 50 SS soldiers to strip naked in the open air and make the Nazi salute, with their arms raised toward the sun, while they threw buckets of ice-cold water at them. This practice had been carried out by the guards themselves, with the Jews and other prisoners before. However, there was a condition that if they lowered their arms for any reason, they would be executed. All 50 Germans were shot before the end of the afternoon. Within a few days, the Dachau massacre had been completed. Although official figures accepted by the United States government suggest that the German prisoners killed were between 50 and 100, some other sources indicate that there may have been more than 500. General Eisenhower celebrated the liberation of the camp and announced that 32,000 prisoners had been rescued, while American troops had killed some 300 enemies. The conditions under which these deaths occurred, however, became known almost 70 years later, when those responsible could no longer be judged. All these facts show us that the Allies were not held accountable at Nuremberg alongside the Nazis for their atrocities against humanity, and the great majority of the criminals who acted in pursuit of their wildest instincts died old in freedom, considered veteran heroes. However, there are still many researchers and historians who allow these stories to cross the barrier of ostracism and remind us that it does not matter which side you are on. There are those who pursue noble ideals, but also those who take up arms and harm the innocents they swore to protect, just to try to capture a spark of that useless power that fades as quickly as tears in the rain. Thank you so much for following us to the end. If you liked our content, don't forget to like the video and follow our channel. See you next time.